Head of Political and Government Investigations, Derek Spitz, who is one of our specialist counsel of 1 Essex Court, and Adam Wagner of Doughty Street Chambers. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Just before we start, we obviously have had the terrible news over the weekend that Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks passed away very sadly at the age of 72. He had a huge amount more to give, I'm sure, and in his life he had a huge impact on very many of us. He had a very huge personal impact on me, and I think I'm just one of many hundreds of thousands of people probably whose lives were enriched by his teaching, who he inspired in some way. And he also had an impact on campaign against anti-Semitism. When we speak about anti-Semitism, we very often find ourselves quoting Rabbi Sacks because there is simply no better way of describing anti-Semitism, of describing its effects, than the words that Rabbi Sacks used. His loss is a huge loss for the whole world, not just the Jewish world. And I personally think that one of the marks of one of the measures of him as a man is the pride that was felt, I think, universally by Jews when we heard him talking about the Jewish religion and the Jewish way of life and the Jewish tradition to people who aren't Jewish. And also the fact that every time we heard him speak, we really felt that we wanted to go out and tell everybody that what we had heard from him. Usually not with the same effect because he had a completely unique delivery. But he is very, very sadly missed, and I've been struck by the outpouring of grief that we've seen throughout the Jewish community and throughout the wider public as well. Britain's lost one of its great thinkers, and the world and the Jewish world has lost one of its great theologians and philosophers, and we're very much the poorer for it. We're here obviously tonight to talk about the Equality and Human Rights Commission's report that came out just over a week ago. It feels like it came out months ago. It's been a very, very busy time for campaign against anti-Semitism since that report came out. It was a very busy time for campaign against anti-Semitism before the report came out. And I think that we're going to go in a little bit of detail into how it all came about, what the context was, and we're going to go into some analysis of it with Derek and Adam in particular. But it really is a report that was striking in that it went, I think, about as far as it could within the legal framework that the Equality and Human Rights Commission works within. And it also was absolutely damning of the anti-Semitism that we've seen in the Labour Party during what one might loosely call the Corbyn years. And it gives a very robust set of recommendations and roadmap for Labour overhauling itself to excise that institutional anti-Semitism from within the party. But it makes a very important recognition, which is that this is not just about updating disciplinary processes, this is about changing the culture as a whole within the Labour Party that allowed this to happen and allowed anti-Semitism to flourish. So we will be discussing all of that. Before we do, I think we'll just take a slight trip backwards to talk a little bit about the work that Campaign Against Anti-Semitism has done and how we came to be here. I'll call on Joe Glassman, our Head of Political and Government Investigations, to tell some of that story. But just to set the scene, Joe, do you want to tell everybody about the first conversation that you and I had about Jeremy Corbyn in 2015?
Yes, I think this is the moment at which the story starts for us. Obviously, we had been, observing what had happened inside the Labour Party and the first signs of that, of anti-Semitic discourse starting to flourish within the party, and looking in particular at the things that Jeremy Corbyn was saying. And I remember actually just starting this with quite a small human moment when I crossed the room, picked up the phone to you, and said something that seems very obvious now, but was not that obvious to the world at that point, I don't think, which was that he should be reported to the Labour Party under its own rules. And I remember sharing that with you, and you saying, you giving that the green light, and us actually then embarking on making a complaint to the Labour Party, which was a formally formulated one under the international definition, and we sent it to Tom Watson, who ignored it completely. The party didn't respond at all. And I think that was indicative of what was to come. Following that, going into early 2018, many of the people watching will remember that we had a rally outside Labour HQ, attended by thousands. And at that time, we submitted a second complaint to the Labour Party. And 1,000 people at the demo signed a co-complaint, which we delivered by hand the next day to the party. And I think at that point, Jenny Formby, the General Secretary, decided that she'd better reply to us. She did reply to us, dismissing what we had actually, our complaint out of hand. And at this point, I think actually, Gideon, you might want to wind back a bit to contact between us and the EHRC in 2017. But at this point, we were able to go to the EHRC and say, here we are, Jewish organisation, we've submitted these legitimate complaints under Labour's rules to the Labour Party, and they are completely ignoring us. And that was a black and white show of discriminatory behaviour against Jews, which we could present in a formal manner. And it was not long after that they invited us to submit evidence for a formal investigation. And that's the story of how it began. I think what's interesting about it is that we were very, very clear-eyed at a time when a lot of people were understandably in denial, when some people in the community thought they could handle it and that it wasn't going to be a problem. And we found ourselves in a really very lonely place at that time. Some quarters we were vilified for it. But I think we could just see with our eyes open that what was happening was anti-Semitism, that it was only going to end one way. And because of that, because as an institution, as a charity, we can see these things in a way that I think others haven't been able to. We were maybe a year or two ahead of everybody else, and that's of great practical significance, because if we hadn't started when we had started, it's quite possible that the EHRC might not have completed its investigation even now, and I would not have had the impact that it had. So I think that completes the story of how things started. Gideon, you might want to talk about first interactions with the EHRC in 2017.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, the story goes back even further, because I remember the first time that you and I talked about Jeremy Corbyn in 2015. I remember you'd spotted Jeremy Corbyn was gathering nominations to make a run for party leadership. And you said, we need to have a meeting about Jeremy Corbyn. And I said, who's Jeremy Corbyn? Because I'd never heard of him before.
That first meeting, yes.
And so it goes back, that far. And I think the first proper incident that we looked at within Labour to see how Jeremy Corbyn was going to deal with things as leader, because when he was a leadership candidate, we knew that he was, he'd already called Hamas and Hezbollah his friends. We knew that he'd defended Sheikh Raed Salah, who had accused Jews of the blood libel, of using the blood of non-Jewish children for ritual purposes. We knew that he'd defended Reverend Stephen Sizer, who'd said that Mossad had done 9/11. We didn't know all of the things that would come out later. We didn't know yet, for example, about the mural and various discoveries that we made, that others made along the way. But I think when we had in 2015 the first incident to look at, it was the incident of Gerald Kaufman, the late Sir Gerald Kaufman, who had stood up not in Parliament but on the parliamentary estate to a sort of fringe meeting within Parliament. They were talking about Israel, and Gerald Kaufman stood up and said, well, I can say things that you can't, that not everyone can say, essentially because he was Jewish. And he essentially went and said that, that Jews in Britain were funding the Conservative Party in order to stop criticism of Israelis when they shot, and to quote Gerald Kaufman, Arab-looking people. So there was this sort of pretty nasty allegation that British Jews were essentially channeling their money into the Conservative Party so that so that Jews in Israel could shoot Arabs. And there was we made a complaint about it at the time. We went in pretty hard on it, and Jeremy Corbyn initially didn't seem to want to do very much about it. He then told Gerald Kaufman he had to apologize. Kaufman said, I'm not apologizing. And Jeremy Corbyn essentially responded to the problem by saying, well, what do you want me to do? I asked him to apologize and he won't. He wouldn't discipline Kaufman, and he wouldn't institute proceedings. And we then had Naz Shah, we had Ken Livingstone, and we had the Chakrabarti report of 2016. And I think one of the ways that CAA certainly stood out back then was that we were exposing a huge amount of the low-level incidents that were happening within the Labour Party. And this was a party which was traditionally the political home of about 70% of British Jews. It was the party which had introduced pretty much all of our anti-racist legislation in the UK, including creating the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And yet the Labour Party wasn't doing anything about these cases. And we were exposing cases, but also when the party did decide to investigate and it created the Chakrabarti report, I think we were pretty much the only organisation in this area which said we're not even going to make submissions to the Chakrabarti inquiry because its terms of reference are so flawed that it's impossible that the Chakrabarti report is going to be even-handed and fair. And of course, when the Chakrabarti report came out, it was a complete whitewash. And I think that the first sentence of the report really says it all when it says Labour doesn't have an institutional problem with anti-Semitism. And we know it all. We also know from that time that Chakrabarti was given a peerage. It was the first time that that Corbyn had ever said that he would give anybody a peerage. It was the first time he nominated anybody, and he was somebody who'd said that he was going to abolish the House of Lords. So we were in a place where we were calling the Labour Party institutionally anti-Semitic. We were exposing a huge number of incidents, but we were somewhat ahead of the curve in that, to a large extent, there were a lot of people who wouldn't believe that the Labour Party had a problem with anti-Semitism, including within the Jewish community. Now, when we made that first complaint that Joe mentioned against Jeremy Corbyn, that was groundbreaking in itself, but it went completely unanswered by the party until, as Joe said, in 2018, we made two further complaints. And as Joe mentioned, in between 2016 and 2018, we also started to look at the Equality and Human Rights Commission and making a complaint at referral to the EHRC. And that began during the 2017 Labour Party conference. And that was a time of huge activity for us. We had constant streams of reports coming in from the Labour Party conference floor, where people were attending fringe events where they were saying things like, we need to have a debate, Holocaust, yes or no, as in, let's debate whether the Holocaust even happened. They had, this was the famous interview that Len McCluskey, the head of Unite the Union, gave, where he said that anti-Semitism was just mood music being used to undermine Jeremy Corbyn. And we approached the EHRC around then, and they made this extraordinary statement. Their chief executive, Rebecca Hilsenrath, made this statement in which she said that the Labour Party had to do more to prove that it was not an anti-Semitic party. And if you consider that, that really flips on its head the normal burden of proof, because the normal burden of proof is innocent until proven guilty. And what Rebecca Hilsenrath was saying in this statement is there's an awful lot of smoke coming from the Labour Party, and we need to see you do more to prove that there isn't something for us to investigate. We need to see you prove some innocence here, because otherwise we may well come and have a look. Now, at that point, the EHRC wasn't contemplating an investigation, but that was the statement, and that was very much the sentiment. And we were talking to the EHRC from Labour Party conference in 2017 until July 2018, when we formally made the referral. And the reason that we took so long is, if you think about it, we at Campaign Against Anti-Semitism go to a lot of different bodies and ask them to take action against anti-Semites. And some bodies really understand anti-Semitism, or they make the effort to understand it, and they do a phenomenal job. Whereas there are some investigative authorities or bodies, regulators, for example, which don't understand anti-Semitism, they don't get it, and they don't do what's right by the Jewish community. And we wanted to make sure that the EHRC, if it investigated something which I think was, it's fair to say, was of the greatest importance to the Jewish community over the last several years, we wanted to make sure that the EHRC was going to do a really thorough, in-depth job. So we took our time to get to know the EHRC, to understand how its work is carried out. And in July 2018, we made our formal referral to the EHRC. And they came to us, they came back to us with a series of questions. And it was very clear that they really wanted to get under the skin of this problem to really understand it. And we started making, with the help of Adam and Derek, we started to make a series of submissions which ran into hundreds of pages, explaining anti-Semitism on the left, explaining anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, and adding our evidence that we had gathered over the years through the projects that, through the research that Joe leads. And during the course of that provision of evidence, there was this conversation going on with the EHRC where they would keep coming back to us with questions. And there was also a process whereby Labour activists started to blow the whistle. And I'm sure that everybody remembers the Panorama programme that the BBC broadcast of Labour whistleblowers talking about anti-Semitism within the party. Now, that was a programme where I think all of the whistleblowers in that programme ended up giving in evidence to the EHRC, and these were Labour staffers. They'd been Labour supporters, Labour voters their whole lives. They'd been mostly activists within the party. And there were also other Labour groups which got organised and started to submit evidence in support of our referral as well. So Labour Against Anti-Semitism, Jewish Labour Movement put in evidence as well. And so over time, the Equality and Human Rights Commission started to build this very, very clear picture of what was going on within the Labour Party. And at the beginning of last year, in May last year, the EHRC gave notice that it was opening a formal Section 20 statutory investigation into anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. That's the second time that it has ever opened a statutory investigation. The only other time it's done that was in relation to racism and discrimination within the Metropolitan Police Force. They had previously written to the British National Party, but even with the BNP, they hadn't felt the need to open a statutory investigation. With Labour, they did. So that more or less, I think, brings us up until the point of the report being issued. I'm going to ask Derek and Adam to talk about the legal significance of the findings there. So if you haven't read the report, don't worry, you can listen to Adam and Derek and get the juice of it. And what we're then going to do, once Adam and Derek have spoken, is we're going to start taking questions from everybody, because the point of this really is not just to give you the in-depth history and to give you the in-depth analysis, but also to answer your questions. So you'll see that there is a Q&A button on your Zoom app where you can submit questions. So as you think of them, just send them in. We'll take them in batches. And even better, if you want to, if you find it more helpful, if you send an email to events@antisemitism.org, that's events with an S on the end at antisemitism.org, then we will collate all of those questions and answer them as well. So I'm going to now ask Adam and Derek to talk a little bit about their legal analysis of the report, and not just in relation to the Labour Party, but there are parts of the report really which set standards which all political parties are going to need to abide by, and that's very much part of our future plans.
Thanks, Gideon. Well, first of all, I'll just give my bit of the story, which won't take very long, but Gideon, I think, got in touch in late August 2018 to say, you know, we've got this complaint that we've made, and the Commission now wants us to bolster that with a proper legal submission, and would you be interested? And I was really pleased, because I had been banging my head against this issue for quite a long time, publicly, on social media, privately, and I felt it was high time that a human rights organization got involved and gave a sort of objective view. And we spent a couple of months on our first submission. It was just me at the time. I think Derek came a little bit after that, and in fact, it was dated the 9th of November. So it was exactly 2 years ago today that we put in that first submission. And I was just looking back on it, and we haven't published the submission, but we did it. We published a short summary of it, and we made basically 3 points there. The first point we made was an unacceptable number of incidents of unlawful discrimination, harassment, and victimization have occurred in Labour over recent years, and they've occurred at all levels of the party and continue to occur. Secondly, that Labour's complaints and disciplinary process is ineffective, opaque, poorly resourced, and continues to be undermined by political interference. And the third point we made was that, and I guess this was the widest point and the most difficult one, was that a culture has developed in Labour which encourages anti-Semitism, and that included a culture of denial and victimization. And we worked really hard, and I've got to pay tribute to the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism team, who, you know, unbelievably, the dedication they put into, you know, the amount of detail, the attention to detail, the number of incidents that we reported, we were providing monthly updates for quite a long time on just what was happening in the Labour Party, and that itself is a kind of book-length document. And I know from when we were speaking to the Commission, they found all that extremely useful. There was just a huge amount of work that went into this. You know, I don't want to say blood, sweat, and tears, but I'm sure there were all three of those things throughout. So really, across the whole team, it was a real team effort. We put in a number of legal submissions. We did one which focused very much on the culture of denial, and then one on the kind of philosophical and structural, or I guess the philosophical and political background to all of this. And ultimately, looking back on those 3 points that we made across quite a lengthy submission at first, they really were the points that the Commission made in its final report. And I think there's a lot in there, and I really recommend you read it, because it gets to the heart of a lot of what was going on in Labour. But I think there were 3 main points that the Commission made. First of all, it found that there were serious failings of leadership, and it was hard not to conclude that anti-Semitism within the Labour Party could have been tackled more effectively if the leadership had chosen to do so. And obviously what they're saying now is the leadership did not choose to do so. They looked at a sample of 70 cases. So they didn't look at all of the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. They had to deal with it proportionally, which is what they said from pretty much the beginning. They would pick a representative sample and then look into those. And they found amongst the 70 cases that the leader's office had interfered in 23. So roughly a third of those cases, almost exactly a third, including one about Jeremy Corbyn himself. And they found that interference was indirect discrimination against Jewish people. The second main point they made was reflecting very much what we have been saying all along, which is what the Jewish Labour movement have been saying. And in fact, what a number of previous reports has said was that there was an inadequate process for handling anti-Semitism complaints across the Labour Party and multiple failures in the system it used to resolve them. A significant number of anti-Semitism complaints were not investigated at all. And when they were, the guidance on sanctions was unclear and inconsistent and opaque. And the failure to put in place adequate training was, again, indirect discrimination against Jewish people, because the Labour Party just handled these complaints completely differently than they handled other kinds of complaints. And the Commission looked at unlawful harassment, looked at sexual harassment claims in particular. And the third point that the report made was that the Labour Party itself was responsible for unlawful acts of harassment against Jewish people. And harassment is violating a person's dignity. And there were two such cases that they found, one involving Ken Livingstone and the other a former councillor, amongst the 70 investigated. And those acts, they said, and they made a big point of this, included using of anti-Semitic tropes and suggesting that complaints of anti-Semitism were fake or smears. And I was really pleased to see that the Commission, in a number of points in the report, make clear that calling anti-Semitism fake or smears, referring to it as a witch hunt or politically an invention of the Zionist lobby and what have you, that these were part of the not just anti-Semitism but unlawful harassment, which is something that we made very clear, and I think will have significant implications. But the report, although they found two incidents which the Labour Party were directly responsible for of harassment, they called that the tip of the iceberg, because they found in 18 other cases, so 18 of the 70, a person had committed conduct which would amount to harassment and held a position of responsibility in the Labour Party. However, there was not enough evidence to determine legally whether the Labour Party itself was responsible. And that's really the difference between a councillor, a Labour councillor or a Labour MP harassing someone in an anti-Semitic way, and them doing it on behalf of the Labour Party. And you might think, well, what is the difference? But it's a legal point they had to make because of the nature of their legal powers. And they found that in many more files, there was evidence of anti-Semitic conduct by ordinary Labour members. And they went on to make a number of recommendations. The most widely reported was that the Labour Party must, until it's rebuilt the trust of the Jewish community, commission an independent process for anti-Semitism complaints. And overall, to make sure it had and I'm quoting, a system and culture that encourages members to challenge inappropriate behaviour and report anti-Semitism complaints. And really, just to summarise, this regulator has only ever done this once before. It's been around for over 10 years. It's only ever done one investigation and using its statutory powers. That was in the Metropolitan Police relating to racism against Black people. And there's a certain neatness there, because I do think that this does go back to the Macpherson report into the Stephen Lawrence murder and this definition of institutional racism. It's something that we very much said all along, that this was an example of institutional racism. And the Commission didn't go there because really it's not within their powers to do so. But if you add all the factors together, I think that's the only real conclusion that you can reach, in my view anyway. So there's a certain neatness to it being the Labour Party and the Metropolitan Police, because there is that element of there's an institutional element to both that needs to be dealt with through culture, through leadership, through complaint systems, through training, the whole sort of range of tools that an organisation has to deal with it. And I'll leave Derek to pick up on points that I haven't mentioned.
Thanks very much, Adam. Picking up actually where Gideon started this evening, Rabbi Lord Sachs had the following to say on anti-Semitism in a speech to the House of Lords on the 13th of September 2019, and I'm quoting from his speech. He said, "Anti-Semitism, or any hate, becomes dangerous when three things happen. First, when it moves from the fringes of politics to a mainstream party and its leadership. Second, when the party sees that its popularity with the general public is not harmed thereby. And three, when those who stand up and protest are vilified and abused for doing so. All three factors exist in Britain now. I never thought that I would see this in my lifetime. That is why I cannot stand silent, for it is not only Jews who are at risk, so too is our humanity." That was in his address to the House of Lords. Now, the election result of December 2019 may have shown that a party's popularity is indeed harmed when anti-Semitism moves into the mainstream. And with the EHRC's report, we may be seeing the beginning of the end of the vilification, perhaps. But in any event, there's no room for a sense of triumphalism in any of this. In a way, having a powerful report in the back pocket means being able to speak with a resolute but understated voice. Campaign Against Anti-Semitism have filed a further 15 complaints against Jeremy Corbyn and against a number of other members of the then shadow cabinet and MPs. It has asked that these complaints be determined under the new independent disciplinary machinery, and the Labour Party, that the Labour Party is required by the Commission to set up. While there's obviously room for collective responsibility, it's also important to ensure that there is individual responsibility. And there's an additional, fairly subtle, but I think quite important point in the report, and that is that it treats Jewish people as falling within two of the protected characteristics under the equality legislation, namely both the protected grounds of race or ethnicity and religion. This is significant, I think, because it entails a recognition against those who deny Jewish peoplehood that Jews constitute both an ethnic group and a religious group. So it may amount to an express recognition of important elements of Jewish peoplehood. Now, how to think about the Commission's treatment of what David Hirsch has referred to as the Livingston formulation and what we referred to as this second order discourse that arises, a kind of denialist discourse, which calls into question the bona fides of the people making the complaints. David Hirsch termed this the Livingston formulation to describe this kind of delegitimizing of those raising the complaints of anti-Semitism by deflection, by the attribution of improper motives, by gaslighting, and so on. What the report does in looking at some of the specific examples is that it refers to a Labour Party councillor who described as bogus the anti-Semitism accusations and referred to, and I'm quoting, the fifth column in the Labour Party saying, quote, "The lobby miscalculated. The witch hunt has created brand new fight back networks. The lobby will then melt back into its own cesspit." That was the one example that the Commission looked at. The other was that it found a form of unlawful harassment amounting to indirect discrimination to suggest that the complaints of anti-Semitism were fake or smears. And here it referred to Ken Livingston's allegation that scrutiny of anti-Semitic conduct was part of a smear campaign by the Israel lobby to stigmatize critics of Israel as anti-Semitic and to claim that complaints were intended to undermine and disrupt the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. The Livingston formulation may on its own terms now enjoy the status of having become an anti-Semitic trope. Certainly calling Jewish bona fides into question and attributing ulterior motives to them has its own long history. But what is beyond doubt is that in the Commission's report is that it can be and often is a form of harassment of Jewish people on the basis of a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, namely race or ethnicity, or religion. To do so, the Commission found, in other words, that what Jews had been saying all along for a number of years was true. I think it's important at the same time to approach this new tool and to use it judiciously so as not to devalue its very powerful currency. And that means, I think, concentrating on senior officials and MPs in political parties in the first instance. And as Gideon mentioned, this report is obviously directed and focused on the Labour Party, but the Commission makes the point that it applies to all political parties. Something further should be said about the number of complaints. Adam has dealt with the sample and the fact that this was the tip of the iceberg. In an interview with Jonathan Friedland that some of you may have seen last week, the Commission Executive Director, Alistair Pringle, is reported as saying about the complaints of anti-Semitism that, and I'm quoting, there were hundreds of them, and they were absolutely atrocious. The language, the behavior, it was shocking. Campaign Against Anti-Semitism submitted hundreds and hundreds of such complaints and examples. And they've produced, and this is immensely to their credit, they have produced a fine-grained archive of all of this over a number of years. And I've no doubt that this will be a resource to researchers and academics in the future. The battle isn't over, and these difficulties are likely to persist, and that's likely to mean that more of the same research and investigation is required. Adam has mentioned aspects of the findings on the culture and leadership, and I'm not going to repeat those. It is worth highlighting, though, the comparison that the Commission drew between the way in which the Labour Party deals with complaints of sexual harassment, the mechanisms in place, the training in place, and the comparison with what was available and what was implemented in relation to anti-Semitism. And the Commission used the former to measure the shortcomings in the latter. I think also, and this is the last point that I want to make, that we should not forget how remarkable and damning is the finding of political interference in anti-Semitism complaints. That is, interference that took place outside the normal disciplinary process. And the Commission found that this took place in the office of the then leader of the opposition. Fortunately, political interference in the disciplinary deliberations of a disciplinary body is not the sort of thing that we are used to in this country. And I think that the Commission has taken an enormous step towards ensuring that we will never need to grow accustomed to it either. For me, it's been a privilege to be involved in this project and to see it through to what I think is an enormously significant result. I think I will leave it on that note and pass back to Gideon and to any questions.
Derek, thank you very much. And it's been a great privilege to have you acting pro bono for us as well on this as well, and to be working with Adam. And I should mention, Joe has led a huge team of people within Campaign Against Anti-Semitism who have worked at great cost to themselves over the course of years to put together the evidence that we put together and to provide the Equality and Human Rights Commission with everything that they needed. We've been getting a lot of questions in, and you can still send in your questions to events@antisemitism.org or using the Q&A feature on Zoom. We're going to aggregate and join the questions as much as possible so that we get through as many as possible, and we're going to go for very short, sharp answers where we can. The first question, did the EHRC find that Labour was institutionally anti-Semitic? If not, why not? I think actually Adam has really answered that question, but it does find that the Labour Party was institutionally anti-Semitic. If you read the report, as Adam said, it's inescapable as a conclusion that that's what the report found. Did it use the words institutionally anti-Semitic? No. And the reason for that is because within the Equality Act, which the Equality and Human Rights Commission enforces, that kind of language isn't used. So we would expect them to use the legal language that they would normally use, and that is of unlawful discrimination, harassment, and victimization, which they did in fact find. The next question, and I think I'll ask this one to Adam, who did the EHRC mention in the report by name? And are we surprised that more individual names weren't mentioned?
Well, are we surprised? They didn't mention, that many people by name in the sense of saying these people did anti-Semitic acts. They left out which of the 18 cases of the 70 they thought were anti-Semitic conduct, and they referred specifically only to 2 anti-Semitic acts which the Labour Party itself was responsible for. And I think, was it surprising that more? Yeah, I mean, if this was a public inquiry, they would have gone into chapter and verse as to the anti-Semitism that they was reported to them, and whether it was harassment, victimization, discrimination. But because they had this narrow remit of only being able to show, they had to show something was unlawful act, so harassment, victimization, or discrimination of some kind. They had to show that it was the legal person, the Labour Party that it was investigating, caused that unlawful act, so were responsible for it. So where they could show that, which was in 2 of the 70 cases, they referred to the specific case and why. Where they couldn't, they didn't, and I think they probably didn't because they didn't have to. So they didn't. Could they have done, more chapter and verse on the issues that they found? Yes, they could have done. It was up to them proportionately, and also in terms of what they wanted to get out of it. That they could hang the recommendations, which were really serious recommendations, on the findings they made, and didn't have to go further than that. So I don't know. I mean, you really have to ask the Commission in the coming months and years, when they're willing to talk about it, why they made the decisions they made.
A nice quick question, I think, for Derek. Has the EHRC, the EHRC launched its investigation in mid-2019. We've had a few questions about the timing of the report, the amount of time it took to do the investigation. Do you think it's reasonable that the EHRC took as long as it did to investigate this?
I mean, the short answer, I think, is yes. I think that they received an enormous amount of material from Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, as I think we've all said, hundreds and hundreds of pages of legal argument and evidence over the period of time that they had to engage with. And from various other parties, they received an enormous amount of material too. I think they recognize, I mean, I don't know this, but I suspect that they recognized how closely watched the investigation and the report would be. I think, given the history of the previous reports that were not particularly impressive documents, I think that they wanted to make sure that they got it right, and that took the time that it took. So I don't think that there was any delay that one could complain about. I think that they did a very thorough job. And they produced a very compelling document as a result.
So another one for Adam. Has the EHRC ever made a finding of this sort before? Has it ever made different findings?
I don't think they've made an they've sent an unlawful act notice before, and I may be wrong about that, but that was my understanding.
No, they told us that they haven't actually.
Yeah,
right.
I think they told us they hadn't, and I have looked around to see whether that's right, and I don't think they have. So really, this is a complete, unique occurrence for them. It's the first time. It's only the second investigation of this kind they've carried out. I think there was talk at the time of the BNP being another one, but the BNP wasn't a formal, so they can do they've got a variety of different enforcement powers, up to an investigation, which is the most kind of severe enforcement power they can exercise, which will lead, if they make findings, to an unlawful act notice. But I think this was the first time ever, so the answer's
great.
No.
Okay, and so the next one for Derek: are the EHRC's recommendations legally binding? Can they be enforced, and if so, what is the timeline?
They can be enforced. The program that the Labour Party needs to develop is one in which the Commission will have input, and the program for remediation will be subject to the Commission's approval. And I think then the Commission is entitled to oversee its implementation and to make sure that that program is given effect to. And they are entitled to reopen their investigation in the event that the recommendations are not implemented. And I'm not certain about this. Adam will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that they are entitled to approach a court if necessary for relief to compel compliance with the recommendation. So they do certainly have teeth. The recommendations, I think, are very likely, highly likely. I'd be surprised if there was, if any other result, highly likely to be implemented, and probably sooner rather than later.
Okay, we've had a few questions now on prosecutions, and people asking, the report makes findings of unlawful acts of harassment and discrimination. Does that mean that criminal prosecutions are automatically possible? Adam, do you want to explain a little bit about why a finding of this kind doesn't automatically mean that people can be prosecuted?
Well, it's a different, what we call in the legal profession a standard of proof. So there are two standards of proof in law. There's the criminal standard, where you've got to be sure of something to find it in a court, so or what's popularly known as beyond reasonable doubt. And then there's what's called the civil standard, which is just something's more likely than not, so over 50%. And the Commission will only have been working on the civil standard of proof, so the findings they made are only more likely than not, and they wouldn't necessarily lead to criminal prosecutions. But what they could potentially lead to is civil damages claims, and I think there's a, subject to them being in time, because you can't bring claims after a certain period. I think there is the potential for, because of not just the findings they made, but the way in which they described unlawful harassment. So, for example, talking about calling anti-Semitism, which you have no direct personal experience of a particular issue, calling it smears and a witch hunt. The fact that that could potentially be unlawful harassment, I think, could open up people to potential claims for civil damages at the least.
We've had a couple of people asking a question about contract law. We've so obviously got some lawyers listening in. Why didn't CAA consider taking legal action against Labour under contract law to investigate Corbyn breaking the party's rules? Now, we did consider it. We didn't think that was going to be the best route. Derek or Adam, do you want to briefly talk through why that isn't a route we pursued?
Well, I don't want to break any legal privileges. I'll just explain what it means. So the Labour Party is a membership organisation governed by a constitution and by effectively contracts between members and the party, and that's why when people take the Labour Party or any political party to court, it's a claim in contract, and it's a funny old quirk of how it works. But the problem with any contractual claim is you've got to be directly affected yourself, personally affected by and you've got to be party to the contract. So with this issue, it was so wide and it was so complicated, it would have been far more appropriate. The High Court would have just said, stuck their hand up and said, we don't want to deal with it, we can't deal with all this, give us the specifics, or keep it narrow. Whereas the Equality and Human Rights Commission was always going to be the most likely public body, or the most appropriate public body, to bring this kind of wide-ranging, complex issue to.
Just to add very briefly to that, I think it's also a question of remedies. The remedy for a breach of contract would be an individually tailored remedy, usually a damages remedy, the payment of compensation. The remedy that one looks for at the Human Rights Commission is a structural remedy that really gets into the finer grain of the Labour Party's process, and its recommendations can go far further, I think, than a contractual remedy in restructuring and putting right from a structural point of view what it identifies as what has gone structurally wrong. That kind of remedy is not one that the courts are comfortable with, and certainly not comfortable with in a contractual context.
We've had some questions now on Jeremy Corbyn himself, and to broadly put them together, they ask, are we disappointed that the EHRC focused on the leader of the opposition's office rather than Corbyn himself? Are we disappointed that Corbyn himself isn't made more of a focus of the report? And I'll answer that one. The fact is that anti-Semitism in the Labour Party went well beyond, and still does go well beyond, Jeremy Corbyn. And it would be a very stunted report that looks purely at Jeremy Corbyn and makes the focus about him, not least because the EHRC had to arrive at findings on what was done within the Labour Party. And by focusing, for example, on the leader of the opposition's office, as opposed to Jeremy Corbyn himself, the EHRC was able to look at the actions of Jeremy Corbyn's staff, and without having to try to necessarily figure out whether they were acting exactly on Jeremy Corbyn's precise instructions or whether they were acting of their own initiative. We've also had questions about what the response has been from within the Jewish community to the report. And I think very simply, the response of the community has been that everyone's phenomenally relieved. You know, this was a period of nearly 5 years, during which time Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the opposition, leader of the Labour Party, during which anti-Semitism became institutionalised and the Labour Party started to become a party which Jewish people in the UK saw as a threat. And it's absolutely vital, I think, that at the conclusion of all of this, what we hope is the beginning of the end at least, that British Jews saw British justice come to their aid. And that's what the Equality and Human Rights Commission has done. So there's been a lot of relief, not just that the Labour Party now has a roadmap that it must follow, but also that British justice actually did come to the aid of the Jewish community. We're going to ask a couple more questions here about Labour as opposed specifically to the EHRC. First question is, will Labour have to introduce an independent disciplinary process now? And the answer to that is yes. We've spoken a little bit about the timeline for an action plan. One of the things that the EHRC has required the Labour Party to do is to introduce an independent disciplinary process until such time as confidence is restored within the Labour Party, within the Jewish community, as to the Labour Party's handling of anti-Semitism complaints. We'll see what that time frame looks like, because I think it's going to take a very long time for people in the Jewish community to have faith in the Labour Party to deal with this issue properly. We've had a question about how important disciplinary processes are versus culture in the party, and the importance of reforming both the disciplinary processes and the party itself. Joe, do you want to answer that question?
I think just sort of taking it back to basics, campaign against anti-Semitism's motif is tzedek, tzedek, tidof, justice, justice you shall have. In case people listening aren't fully aware of it, you know, we seek justice for British Jews under the law and under the institutional regulation. And so for us, this is enormously important, that a transparent and fair disciplinary process is applied by the Labour Party, and indeed by all political parties. I think in terms of culture, the influence of that is enormous. I think it's when anti-Semites get the signal that they can get away with saying things that breach the laws of that institution, that it spreads, and the anti-Semitic ideas start to flourish and are shared, and that institution becomes anti-Semitic, as we've seen has happened, institutionally anti-Semitic, as we've seen what's happened in the Labour Party. So I think that the two go hand in hand. I think we will see an independent disciplinary process bring about a very chilling effect on those who wish to carry on acting as they did before. I mean, there is a role for education. The party and its leaders need to know that that disciplinary process is in place to provide the guide rails for that culture, for that education to be laid down. So yes, I think it's enormously important.
And maybe a follow-up question for you, Joe. We've had people asking whether the Chakrabarti report helped or hindered Labour's processes. How do you feel about that, having researched many hundreds of cases?
Well, pretty much all of our reports refer to the fact that, you know, when we examine the outcomes of incidents of anti-Semitism in the party, have to be qualified by the fact that the Chakrabarti report does not allow us to know the outcomes of cases. So it kind of slammed the lid shut on us being able to know anything about those processes. It was the very opposite of what one would have thought that an august human rights lawyer like Chakrabarti would actually lay out, because it was non-transparent. So I think it had that effect. I think culturally it cast a pall over the Labour Party because it was just simply such a whitewash.
And a related question for Adam and Derek. Did the EHRC report refute any of the Chakrabarti report's conclusions? You know what? I'll stop that question there, and I'll come to the second bit in the second question.
They didn't really go into it. I mean, you might as well just infer rather than you have to infer from the Commission's report what they thought about the Chakrabarti report. Well, they used the Chakrabarti report, in fact, as we did in our submissions, to say, look, you did your own internal report. There was a number of recommendations. None of them have been implemented. So even on your own terms, if you know, even if you think the Chakrabarti report was a good quality report, which personally I don't, I know CAA don't, it made some recommendations which should have been pretty common sense, such as properly resourcing the disciplinary processes, training, that sort of thing, which just, you know, bread and butter for these kind of situations. They don't just, it's not just the Labour Party that's had these kind of problems with culture and institutional, harassment, those sorts of things. But even on its own terms, they didn't implement the report. But I don't think anybody really looks back on that report and says it was a decent report. It was a good quality report. It made all the right findings. I think it's true. It was effectively a fig leaf that was used to say, well, we've dealt with this problem. But the fact that they went on and didn't even bother implementing almost any of the recommendations goes to show how seriously it was taken, even in the Labour Party.
We've had quite a lot of questions, so I'm just going to ask everybody who's watching. We're managing to whiz through quite a lot of questions. We are going to go past an hour, I think, to try and answer everybody's questions, but we're now going to take final questions. So if you've got any questions, if you could submit them in the next minute or two, and then we'll cut off for questions. We'll continue answering the ones that we've got, and then we will say goodnight to everybody. So the next question is whether Chris Williamson and others challenged the EHRC report as they've claimed online. that's a question for the EHRC to answer. We've obviously been privy to certain things, not to others. As the claimant in the process, we've had a good relationship with the EHRC, but we're not going to be betraying confidences now that the process is finished. Part of the reason that it worked so well is that we were very much a trustworthy party to these proceedings. And so if you've got questions like that, then that's the question really to ask the EHRC. We can't answer whether Chris Williamson did or didn't challenge them, but I think it is fair to say that his claims to have made representations to the EHRC, we'd have no reason to doubt that. Next question is quite a loaded question. It's quite a difficult question. How do you know that Keir Starmer won't just say he's going to do the right thing, but without the spectre of the EHRC report, know that he can't be held to account? And related question, is Keir Starmer going to have to look at all of his MPs and momentum and the grassroots of the Labour Party in cracking down on anti-Semitism? So a couple of things there, and I think everybody's very welcome to chip in on this question. But the first thing, Keir Starmer doesn't have the report hanging over him now. What he does have is a deadline of 10th of December to come up with an action plan, which he must agree with the EHRC, and obviously will be very interested in that action plan. So he's got to agree the action plan with the EHRC, and the EHRC will then be making sure that he complies with the action plan. So we'll have to see what's in the action plan, but this is very much not over for the Labour Party. And I think what some people may have missed in the headlines on the release of the report, which were very much about Corbyn, is that actually this is the beginning of a protracted process now for the Labour Party. They've got deadlines, but it's going to be a long process of reckoning. We expect to see special motions brought to Labour Party conference and other bodies, other decision-making bodies within Labour, in order to make the changes that the EHRC demands and which the action plan agreed with the EHRC demands. So just because the EHRC report isn't looming doesn't mean that Sir Keir Starmer can now breathe a sigh of relief and not do anything. And also, I think it's fair to say, we haven't seen any indication that that's what he wants to do either. I think a lot of people have understandable misgivings about Keir Starmer's years by Jeremy Corbyn's side as, you know, as one of his lieutenants, essentially. But he is now leader of the Labour Party, and the indications so far are that he, whether it's for political or ideological reasons, wants to put this episode behind. And that's the important thing. The important thing is that whatever the reasons are, anti-Semitism now must be dealt with properly. Does there anybody else, Adam, Derek, Joe, do you want to chip in on thoughts on that? And also just to remind you the second part of that question, which is Starmer now going to have to look at all of his MPs and momentum and the grassroots of the Labour Party? Maybe, Joe, you may want to talk a little bit about the complaints we've put in against other senior Labour figures.
Can you hear me? Yes, it might be worth taking a step back to talk about the place where this information is gathered by CAA in the first place, which is a project which is a little buried on our website, but I'd really encourage people to go there. It's called Anti-Semitism and Political Parties. It's in our research section. And this has been the kind of core, the reservoir from which we pump out evidence. And this was the case with the EHRC investigation. So we have, I'll just take a minute to talk about this because there have been some vital players in this in my team, a whole host of other people who gather the evidence, collate the evidence, examine it, test it. We then analyze it. And these reports are then made public on our website. So the idea is that this project, Anti-Semitism and Political Parties, will actually, as Derek alluded to, it provides a resource. And these reports are objective. There's just one part of them that where CAA gives an opinion, there's like a traffic light system, but it's not on the anti-Semitism, it's how the parties dealt with it. So for everybody watching, this is a place where you can see in future as we go forward how the complaints that we have brought against individuals actually progress and whether the party deals with them in a fair and transparent way. And indeed, it's worth mentioning that that we provide a methodology, and you can find the international definition there. So going forward, if people in the community feel that they've witnessed or experienced anti-Semitism disseminated by an officer of any political party, then please get in touch. That's where it all starts. And in fact, it was used as the basis for the evidence we provided to Derek and Adam in order to make submissions for this. And it was also used for the new complaints that we're bringing against MPs. And so if you go there now, you'll actually see the nature of the complaints, because the core information there, the incidents that have occurred and the analysis are all laid out. These will now be, getting to the answer to your question, these have formed the basis of complaints that we've sent to Keir Starmer on the day of the HRC release. And we are still waiting to see how, when Keir Starmer's team will get in touch with us to start responding. They obviously, at the moment, they don't have the independent process in place. As Gideon said, the deadline for providing that to the HRC is the 10th of December. But from that point on, we'll be monitoring those very carefully. Those complaints are limited at this point to sitting MPs who have breached the international definition of anti-Semitism or supported breaches of the international definition. But there are we have a huge pool of data and information and pending reports on officers, not just of the Labour Party, but of all political parties. Obviously, we're a charity. We examine this issue across the board. So you can find those there as well. So we, just in a more general point, there are an army of councillors in the Labour Party and who have similarly breached the definition or supported breaches. And so there will be many more complaints to follow these. These are an important set because they are members of Parliament, sitting members of Parliament in the Labour Party. And so, you know, that's where we are at the moment. We are also trying to interpret the HRC's findings for future reports. So watch this space.
I just wanted to add two points to that, because it touches on the question of culture that was raised earlier, and there's a lot to say about that, and we can't say everything about it, but cultural change is not easy to achieve. I think if one is being realistic, what the thought is that what moved into the mainstream might successfully be sent back to the margins, and that would create a breathing space for all of us, and that would be a realistic objective. But behind all of this, behind what's been happening within the Labour Party, there's a wider debate, and it's a debate on the left. There are various different strands of political opinion and ideological views on the left. The left isn't a monolithic body. There is a strand, and I think in crudish terms, it's the strand that places anti-imperialism above all other values that are traditionally associated with the left. Somehow it's that strand that seems to be more susceptible to anti-Semitic ways of thinking than other strands on the left, such as a strand that would emphasize anti-fascism or anti-totalitarianism. That kind of strand, and both strands and more form part of the left. But the second strand is one that is much more amenable to challenging modes of anti-Semitic thinking. And I think that that debate reflects a wider debate in the culture on the left, not just in the Labour Party, but in academia more broadly. And it's important, I think, to be able to push back a little bit in that debate to facilitate a process of cultural change that will also, one hopes, be reflected in the Labour Party.
Great. Okay, so we're going to enter now a sort of flash round of questions so that we can try and get through the questions that remain from everybody who sent them in. So very, very short answers, Adam, Derek, Joe, when I come to you. First question, Jeremy Corbyn's never going to be Prime Minister. Do we still need to worry? And related, can we really trust Keir Starmer to make changes? He said just before the election, he 100% backed Jeremy Corbyn. So can we really trust him? I think the answer to that has to be, look, Jeremy Corbyn isn't going to be Prime Minister, but that's not the point. The point is about pursuing justice. And there is still a big problem with anti-Semitism amongst the membership of the Labour Party. It does need to be dealt with. And can we trust Keir Starmer? Well, we'll have to wait and see. I understand why people have misgivings about his past years by Jeremy Corbyn's side. I can't tell you whether we should trust him or not. We'll just have to wait and see, and we'll have to see how he responds on December the 10th to the Equality and Human Rights Commission's request for an action plan. We've got another question here. Lots of Jews and others. We've had quite a few people asking whether they should rejoin the Labour Party. That's not a question for us. We're not a political body. We're a charity. We can't take political sides. If you want to join a political party, that is a personal decision for you. That's not something we can try to persuade you one way or the other on. Some people have asked a related question, which is Labour now a safe space for Jews? I think let's wait and see what happens with the implementation of the EHRC's report and the investigation of these complaints that Joe talked about that we've now made to Keir Starmer, including against sitting MPs. Someone's asked, actually more than one person has asked, why do so many Jews vote overwhelmingly to the left? I think that's just a case of their personal political convictions. And the main point from all of this is that Jews should feel completely safe and entitled to vote for whichever political party they feel like. There is a problem in our politics when you have a political party that Jews feel they can't vote for or they can't be a member of because of anti-Semitism. And so our mission is to ensure that there is no political party which harbours anti-Semitism to the extent that it becomes a threat to British Jews and starts to be seen as a threat by British Jews. We're going to come on to some of the questions we've had about the complaints that we've submitted to Labour. We've been asked where you can get more information about the complaints that we've submitted. You can do that at antisemitism.org/EHRC. Nice simple one to remember. Question maybe for Joe here, a very quick answer. Margaret Hodge and some other groups said that Corbyn was too irrelevant to suspend, but he was then suspended. Was CAA involved in that, and was suspending Corbyn the right decision?
Well, I can't answer for Margaret Hodge. I do fundamentally disagree with her that he was unimportant. I think if justice is to be done, then it will certainly be done needs to be done in his particular case for practical and symbolic reasons. Does that answer the question as brief as I can be?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as far as CAA's involvement went, we had 10 a.m. on Thursday, there was the release of the report by the EHRC. 10:15, we put out our press statement in response to the report. Obviously, that was the first time, we've been working on this, as we've said, since 2017, 2018, we made that formal referral. In all of that time, we haven't made any substantive statements on this whole process, on the investigation, on the report. We've kept our lips sealed all along. So 10:15 we released our statement, 10:30 we did our press conference, 11 o'clock Sir Keir Starmer gave his press conference, and we'd had the opportunity to speak to quite a lot of the journalists who were going to be asking him questions at that press conference. And we said to them, look, you know, let's ask about Corbyn. Let's find out what Keir Starmer plans to do. He had a choice then. He could either have said, yes, I'm going to, based on the descriptions of Corbyn in the report, I'm going to suspend him immediately, or he could have evaded a little bit, which he did. He did the latter. He evaded slightly. But one of the things that we had expected to happen, sadly, which did happen, is that Corbyn responded to the report in his completely delusional way, saying that it was, you know, the allegations of anti-Semitism were being overstated for political effect. And we then put in our complaint. We'd prepared a 72-page complaint letter, which Joe mentioned, which is on our website, which said, which included Jeremy Corbyn's reaction to the report as part of our complaint against him. And within an hour of that going in, Sir Keir Starmer had decided to suspend Jeremy Corbyn. I think he did the right thing in the end. And hopefully now what will follow is investigation of all of the other complaints and a thorough disciplinary process against Jeremy Corbyn. We've had questions about whether Jeremy Corbyn is likely to be expelled from the Labour Party, and if so, can he challenge his suspension in court? I would like to see Jeremy Corbyn expelled from the Labour Party, not least because he is responsible for causing just under half of the Jewish community of Britain, according to the polling that we undertook and others undertook, to fear for their future in this country. And I don't think the Labour Party should have people within it who have been responsible for that. Derek or Adam, if Jeremy Corbyn is expelled from the Labour Party, I believe he can challenge that in court, can't he?
Yeah, I mean, he can challenge any decision of the Labour Party which affects him. He could challenge his suspension if he thinks it's not done in the right way. And he can, if he gets some other sanction, he could challenge that, as Chris Williamson successfully did, because the right procedure wasn't followed in his case. It's just you know, it's a membership organization like any other.
Okay, we've had questions here. I'm just having a quick look through to make sure that we aren't missing anything major. Has CAA heard from Labour regarding the complaints? What are the next steps? Well, the next steps are that we've set a 6-month deadline for investigation and acting on the complaints. And it's quite important to us that those complaints are investigated under the new disciplinary process, the independent disciplinary process. So some of that will depend on the timeline for instituting a new disciplinary process. A lot of people asking also what they can do to help. And I suppose one of the most important things you can do actually is volunteer your time, as, for example, Joe does. Joe and the whole of his team are volunteers, and they have put together the vast trove of evidence which has been so instrumental in achieving this outcome. There are lots of people who volunteer within CAA. They don't have often any experience of the kinds of work that we do. We show them what to do. If you come to CAA ready to learn and ready to engage in what can be quite meticulous but very rewarding work, then we've got a role for you. If you don't have time to give, then please donate. You can do so at antisemitism.org/donate. And if you want to volunteer, I should have given the URL for that as well. It's antisemitism.org/volunteer. I'll just go to the next section of questions. We've tried to put the questions into some sections that the team who are watching and gathering everybody's questions have done this. So we've got some questions on the big picture and other political parties. Question here: what are the main lessons from the work that we've done? What are the main lessons for other political parties, and what are the main lessons from the EHRC's report? Derek and Adam, do you want to answer that one?
I think there's important lessons for other political parties because, and you know, I've dealt with lots of investigations and inquiries into organizations that have gone wrong, whether the military, hospitals, political parties, and there are lots of common features when things go wrong, and you know, and of course each organization has its own specific you know, personality, and you know, Derek's talked about the particular, maybe there's a particular political creed that is enamored with these kind of ideas, but ultimately it comes down to the more mundane, the banal, as Hannah Arendt may have put it. You know, it comes down to the leadership protecting itself rather than the people under its responsibility. Complaints and grievance processes becoming a place where people are further discriminated against rather than where problems are resolved. A basic kind of culture of a lack of empathy and civility, and a sort of you're just out to get us kind of approach. And that's why it takes really quite a very strong personality type to become a whistleblower in those situations. And I think you see that in here as well. I won't mention names because there are too many, but the people who stood up in their own institutions and said, this isn't right, Jewish people, not Jewish people. And I think the key thing is, it's the same lesson from the McPherson report, the same lesson that comes out of this, is you have to listen to the people who are making the complaints. And listening is not just about, you know, having a complaints process and, you know, hiving it off to some independent lawyer. It's about truly internalizing what you are hearing, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it means that your colleagues are in the frame, even if it means taking a hard look at your own behavior, you know, as Jeremy Corbyn never did, not a single time in 5 years. That's his, in a way, the worst thing about Jeremy Corbyn is he never internalized any of this. You know, at the very, even his statement that came out after this report. And I think that lesson is something that, you know, if you look at the Conservative Party and the issue with Muslims, you look at other political parties, you know, these problems are not unique, but they should look to the symptoms. They should listen to the people who are the potential victims and the, you know, and the actual and the current victims, and act. And if they don't act early, and they don't listen, and they don't internalize the what they're being told, then they will get to the point where a statutory regulator will have to come in. They will lose political votes as a result. They will shame themselves. You know, in history, the Labour Party, this shame will never really go away. You know, they may make it better. I'm sure they will make it better. I'm sure that things will change, but it will never. It will never go away. This report will always be there. The incidents will always be remembered. So it should be a salutary lesson to, I think, every other political party and similar organization, that these issues, you know, are not unique to anyone, and they have to listen.
If I can just butt in, I can report that you know, we have a number of similar cases across other political parties. I'm not going to go into depth about that now, but talk about lessons being learned and political parties being put on alert. I noticed, for example, that Sian Berry, the co-leader of the Green Party, put out a very simple tweet on the day, which was simply the section about equality law and how it relates to the Green Party, with the relevant parts highlighted, and that's all she tweeted. So I think she's sending out a very powerful message to her party. You know, we have the equality legislation exists, it can be enforced. So she was putting her members on notice. So I think that was almost immediate effect, demonstration of the effect.
Okay, well, we have run over a little longer than we wanted to, which is because we wanted to answer all of the questions. I'm going to very quickly whiz through a couple of last questions myself, and then we will all say goodnight to you. We've had a question, does CAA challenge anti-Semitism in all political parties? We absolutely do. And if you want to see what we do in all political parties, go to antisemitism.org/politics, where you will find the Anti-Semitism in Political Parties project that Joe has been talking about. We've had a question about what effect the EHRC's report will have on local politics. Should I continue making complaints locally? If you see something anti-Semitic in your political party, no matter which political party, report it to the party, but also tell us about it if you could. And the Political and Government Investigations Unit at CAA has a very catchy email address, which is pgiu@antisemitism.org, Political and Government Investigations Unit. And please do get in touch. Will it change things on a local level? We're going to have to see. There was a lot of anti-Semitism within constituency Labour parties during Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. We will have to see what changes. Already we're seeing that, for example, David Evans, the General Secretary of the Labour Party, has told local parties to respond to the report in a particular way and not to start passing motions in solidarity with Jeremy Corbyn and against the report and all this sort of thing. We'll have to see exactly what plays out now. We've had a question about whether the release of this report and the sort of conclusion or at least the beginning of the end of the problem within the Labour Party might herald a greater communal unity and cohesion within the Jewish community. Hopefully, we'll have to see again how all of that plays out. But certainly, I think the Jewish community in Britain is a small community. I mean, the Jewish population in the world is very small, but the Jewish population in Britain is tiny. And the more we can do to speak with a united voice, the more we can do together, I think the stronger we are. So that has always been a goal within CAA, and hopefully that'll be something that bears out. Literally last couple of questions here. You mentioned that some regulators and public bodies are better than others on anti-Semitism. Does CAA have experience with good ones and bad ones? We do. When you look, for example, at the way that the BBC handles allegations of anti-Semitism within the BBC, I think it's fair to say it's pretty appalling. When you see other regulators and the way that they've dealt with anti-Semitism, there have been some examples of some really phenomenal best practice. So hopefully we will be able to use the findings of the report to improve practice in fighting anti-Semitism right across the board, including within other regulators. Is there a scope for an EHRC investigation into anti-Semitism on campuses, both regarding students and academics? There's actually something that CAA has a lot of work planned on. So if you have a particular problem on your campus, please email campus@antisemitism.org. And we've got a specialist team which works with students. We're actually planning quite a lot of legal work over the coming year or so, which we'll be announcing soon. So I don't want to give anything away too early, but we do have a lot of work planned. So if you've got a problem on campus, it's campus@antisemitism.org. And if you know people who are currently students who aren't watching, but you would like to pass that email address on to, please do. There's been a lot of vitriol against Jews online and in pro-Jeremy Corbyn forums since the general election. How can online anti-Semitism be contained? And what is CAA doing to work with social media companies in connection with this sort of anti-Semitic expression? Well, we're working with Google, Facebook, and Twitter. We've also been doing ad hoc work with some of the other social networks. Online anti-Semitism is a huge problem, as we saw, for example, with Wiley's outbursts, and it has been very, very difficult for us to deal with it. It still remains a major problem. And the online harms bill, which the government has been promising for a long time, still isn't scheduled to come into force. We haven't actually even seen what it says yet. It hasn't been released. It isn't scheduled to come into force until about 2024, which will put the UK far behind other countries in dealing with anti-Semitism and other forms of racism and discrimination and hatred online. So We have legal work planned. We're working with the social networks, and we'll have some announcements, by the way, on our legal work. We've actually pioneered a new form of legal action which unmasks anti-Semitic internet trolls. So if you have problems with anti-Semitism online, drop us a note at investigations@antisemitism.org, and we will take a look at it. Is politics CAA's main interest? It certainly isn't. In fact, in 2015 or 2014, we were established in 2014. We certainly would never have imagined taking on such an interest in anti-Semitism in British politics. Unfortunately, the rise of Jeremy Corbyn and anti-Semitism within the Labour Party meant that that was necessary, but it is hopefully something we will be able to divert our attention from to some extent, particularly to campus and online anti-Semitism and crime, although we will, of course, be keeping a very firm eye on what's going on in anti-Semitism in politics. I think that we have now answered pretty much every question that was posed to us. I know that there will be some where, because we amalgamated questions, there might be a specific element of your question that didn't get answered. You can always drop us an email at contact@antisemitism.org, and we do try to answer all of the questions. And particularly, one of the things that's been particularly warming, I haven't actually seen all of this, but the public liaison team, which receives all of our emails, Facebook messages, Twitter direct messages, and also the events team, which has been collating all of the and amalgamating all of the questions that have come in during the Zoom session. They've all told me that we've had a huge amount, a really lovely number of congratulatory messages, which it looks like it's going to take us a very long time to respond to. But thank you very much. It means an awful lot to the volunteers who make all of this possible within CAA, many of whom do so without any recognition or ever being named, and that's the way that they want it. And I think we do convey all of the thanks that we get. We compile it into bulletins that we send to everyone within CAA. So thank you very much for all of the words of congratulation. And just finally, to reiterate to everybody who's been asking how they can help, go to antisemitism.org/act. And there you can either subscribe to our bulletins and help spread the word about what we do. You can volunteer with us, or you can donate if you are able to. And I think, just as a final note, it is the anniversary of Kristallnacht, and I would not make any comparison of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party to the anti-Semitism of Nazi Germany, but it is an example of what happens when hatred runs out of control within politics. And I think we should be very proud in Britain of the way that anti-Semitism in the Labour Party was dealt with. You can always look at something and say Jews should not have had to suffer what they suffered. Of course not. But in the end, British justice came to bear. And also we know from polling that the British electorate, the British public, really despise anti-Semitism. It turns them off. And I think it's very important for us to remember the lessons that have been learned and the huge differences that modern Britain is so proud of today. So thank you very much to everybody who's joined us. Thank you to Joe and Derek and Adam for all of for answering so many questions and staying with us so long after our scheduled end time. If you've got those further questions, just drop them to contact@antisemitism.org. If you want to get involved, go to antisemitism.org/act. And thank you very much indeed for joining us. Good night.